In this chapter, the author Balkis Abdul Kalam shows the status of non-Muslims living under the Islamic rule. As we mentioned, Islam calls some people such as the Jews and Christians, the people of the book, and as such they are allowed to follow their religions if they agree to pay the jizya and live as second citizens. The jizya literally means legal and religious penalty imposed by the Islamic law on the defeated people of the book. The people of the book is applied on Christians and Jews. Jews and Christians living in a Muslim countries are required by the Quran, Surah 9:29, to pay the jizya or else be killed if they refuse to embrace Islam. Christians and Jews are called the people of the book and also called the Tsimis. Paying the jizya is a symbol of humiliation and submission because Tsimis are not regarded as citizens of the Islamic State, although they are, in most cases, natives to the Muslim countries. Sheikh Naji Ibrahim ibn Abdullah summarizes the purpose of the jizya. He says, quoting Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, that the jizya is enacted, to spare the blood, of the Tsimis, Jews and Christians, to be a symbol of humiliation of the infidels and as an insult and punishment to them, and as the Shafi'is indicate, the jizya is offered in exchange for residing in an Islamic country. Thus Ibn Qayyim adds, since the entire religion belongs to God, it aims at humiliating ungodliness and its followers, and insulting them. Imposing the jizya on the followers of ungodliness and oppressing them is required by God's religion. The Quranic text hints at this meaning when it says, until they give the tribute by force with humiliation, Quran, Surah 9:29. What contradicts this is leaving the infidels to enjoy their might and practice their religion as they wish so that they would have power and authority. According to Muslim jurists, the following legal ordinances must be enforced on Tsimis, Christians and Jews, who reside among Muslims. 1. Tsimis are not allowed to build new churches, temples, or synagogues. They are allowed to renovate old churches or houses of worship provided they do not allow to add any new construction. Old churches are those which existed prior to Islamic conquests and are included in a peace accord by Muslims. Construction of any church, temple, or synagogue in the Arab Peninsula is prohibited. It is the land of the Prophet and only Islam should prevail there. Yet, Muslims, if they wish, are permitted to demolish all non-Muslim houses of worship in any land they conquer. 2. Tsimis are not allowed to pray or read their sacred books out loud at home or in churches, lest Muslims hear their prayers. 3. Tsimis are not allowed to print their religious books or sell them in public places and markets. They are allowed to publish and sell them among their own people, in their churches and temples. 4. Tsimis are not allowed to install the cross on their houses or churches since it is a symbol of infidelity. 5. Tsimis are not permitted to broadcast or display their ceremonial religious rituals on radio or television or to use the media or to publish any picture of their religious ceremonies in newspaper and magazines. 6. Tsimis are not allowed to congregate in the streets during their religious festivals, rather, each must quietly make his way to his church or temple. 7. Tsimis are not allowed to join the army unless there is indispensable need for them, in which case they are not allowed to assume leadership positions but are considered mercenaries. By the Muslim historian Makrizi, Muslim doctrine concerning churches. Sharia law is draconian if not hostile to Christian worship. Consider the words of some of Islam's most authoritative and classic jurists, the same ones revered today by Egypt's Salafi. According to Ibn Qayyim, author of the multi-volume Rules for the Tsimis, it is obligatory to destroy or convert into a mosque every church both old and new that exists on lands that were taken by Muslims through force, for they breed corruption. Even if Muslims are not sure whether one of these things churches is old pre-conquest or new, it is better to err on the side of caution, treat it as new, and demolish it. Likewise, Ibn Taymiyyah confirms that the ulama scholars of the Muslims from all four schools of law, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, and others, including Al-Thawri, Al-Layth, all the way back to the companions of the Prophet, and the followers are all agreed that if the Imam destroys every church in lands taken by force, through jihad, such as Egypt, Sudan, Iraq, Syria, This would not be deemed unjust of him, adding that, if Christians resist, they forfeit their covenant, their lives, and their possessions. Elsewhere he writes, wherever Muslims live and have mosques, it is impermissible for any sign of infidelity to be present, churches or otherwise. Echoing the words of the jurists that the church is worse than bars and brothels and houses of torment and fire, in August 2009, Dar al-Ifta, an Al-Azhar University affiliate, issued a fatwa likening the building of a church to a nightclub, a gambling casino, or building a barn for rearing pigs, cats, or dogs. In July 2012, Dr. Yasir al-Burhami, a prominent figure in Egypt's Salaf movement, issued a fatwa forbidding Muslim taxi drivers and bus drivers from transporting Coptic Christian priests to their churches, which he depicted as more forbidden than taking someone to a liquor bar. When it comes to churches, Islamic history is a testimony to Islamic doctrine. Under Muslim rule, from the 7th century to the present, tens of thousands of churches that were once spread across thousands of miles of formerly Christian lands, were attacked, plundered, ransacked, destroyed or converted into mosques. Such a large number is consistent with the fact that, at the time of the Muslim conquests, invasions, half of the world's entire Christian population lived in those lands invaded and subjugated by Islam. According to one medieval Muslim historian, over the 2-year course of a particularly ruthless Christian persecution campaign, some 30,000 churches were burned or pillaged in Egypt and Syria alone. Major church attacks during Abbasid rule include when the Muslims in Jerusalem made a rising in 936 and burnt down the Church of the Resurrection believed to be built atop the tomb of Christ, which they plundered, and destroyed all they could of it. Nearly a century later, Caliph Hakim by Amrullah, 996-1021 AD, ordered that the already ravaged Church of the Resurrection be torn down to its very foundations, apart from what could not be destroyed or pulled up, and they also destroyed the Golgotha and the Church of Saint Constantine and all that they contained, as well as all the sacred gravestones. They even tried to dig up the graves and wipe out all traces of their existence. The arrival of Muslim mujahideen in Egypt in the 7th century caused a Coptic paradigm shift. The history, or plight, of Egypt's Coptic Orthodox Church is well preserved. The history of the Patriarchate of the Egyptian Church, for instance, a multi-volume chronicle begun under Coptic Bishop Severus ibn al-Muqaffa in the 10th century, records innumerable massacres and persecutions over the centuries, from destroyed churches, to crucified Christians, to raped and murdered nuns. Nevertheless, to bypass the objection that Christian writers may have been biased against their persecutors, let us content ourselves with the famous history of Taqi al-Din al-Makrizi, 1364–1442 AD, the most authoritative Muslim scholar of Egyptian history in the Middle Ages. His account appears especially objective when one considers that the pious Muslim Makrizi was no friend to the Christians. For example, after recounting centuries of persecution and church destruction at the hands of Muslims, Makrizi concludes by sounding like a modern-day Salaf, blaming Christians for their own persecution, for from the traces they left, will then be seen how shamefully they intrigued against Islamism and the followers of it, as anyone may know who looks into the lowness of their origin, and the old hatred of their ancestors towards our religion and the doings thereof. In Makrizi's account, things appear relatively quiet during the 1st century of Islam's occupation of Egypt, 641 to 741, no doubt due to the fact that Christians still numerically overwhelmed their Muslim conquerors. By 767, after decades of Coptic uprisings in face of abuses, heavier hardships than ever fell upon the Christians, who were obliged to eat their dead, while their new churches in Egypt were destroyed. The Church of Marianent alongside that of Abu Sanuda in Egypt was also pulled down, as well as that in the ward of Constantine, which the Christians entreated Suleiman ibn Ali, Emir of Egypt, to spare for 50,000 dinars, but he would not. By 845, al-Mutawakkil ordered Christian churches to be pulled down. In 912, the great church in Alexandria, known as that of the Resurrection, was burnt down. In 939, the Muslims made another rising in the city of Ascalon, where they demolished the Greek Church of Mary, and plundered what was in it. Then comes the era of the aforementioned Caliph Hakim by Amrullah, who decimated the Church of the Resurrection in Jerusalem. In the words of al-Makrizi, and in al-Hakim's time, hardships such as one never saw befell the Christians. He then laid his hands on all endowments of the churches and of the monasteries, which he confiscated to the public treasury, and wrote to that effect to all his provinces. He then burnt the wood of a great many crosses, and forbade the Christians to buy men or maidservants which were often set free. He pulled down the churches that were in the street Rashida, outside the city of Misr, Old Cairo. He then laid in ruins the churches of Al-Maks outside Cairo, and made over their contents to the people, who plundered them of more goods than can be told. He threw down the convent of Al-Qasir, and gave it to the people to sack. He then set about demolishing all churches, and made over to the people as prey and forfeit, all that was in them, and all that was settled on them. They were then all demolished, all their furniture and chattels were plundered, their endowments were forfeited to others, and mosques were built in their place. He allowed the call to prayer from the church of Sanuda in Misr, and built a wall around the church of Molyaka, the hanging church, in Kasr-esh-Sima, the palace of heaven. Then many Muslims sent up letters to request to be allowed to search the churches and monasteries in provinces of Egypt. But their request was hardly delivered at headquarters, when a favorable answer was returned to the request, so they took the vessels and chattels of the churches and of the monasteries, and sold them in the marketplaces of Egypt, together with what they found in those churches of gold and silver vessels, and things of the kind, and bartered their endowments. The Emir, the Caliph, also wrote to the intendants of the provinces to support the Muslims in their destruction of the churches and of monasteries. And the work of demolition in Egypt was so general in the year 1012, that according to statements on which one can rely, as to what was demolished at the end of the year 1014, both in Egypt and in Syria and the provinces thereof, of temples built by the Greeks it amounted to more than 3,000 churches, the original Arabic says 30,000. All the gold and silver vessels in them were plundered, their endowments were forfeited, and those endowments were splendid and bestowed on wonderful edifices. Finally, after describing different forms of persecutions against Christians during Hakim's reign, Makrizi, the Muslim historian, makes an interesting observation: under these circumstances a great many Christians became Muslims. In another place, after recounting how the greater number of the churches of the Said, the Upper Egypt had been pulled down, and mosques built in their stead, the historian notes again the typical consequence: more than 450 Christians became Muslims in one day. It bears repeating that the Muslim Makrizi had no great love for Egypt's Christians, and made disparaging observations concerning them in his volumes, thereby making his account of persecution all the more trustworthy. Because Hakim's persecution was so terrible and far-reaching, most modern Western historians acknowledge it, even as they portray it as an aberration of a madman, implying that Christians suffered only under his rule. Yet there is no dearth of Muslim leaders throughout the whole of Islamic history that did not at one time or another persecute Christians and their churches. If Hakim is remembered as a terrible and insane tyrant, consider Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who in the West is depicted as a colorful and fun-loving prankster in the Arabian Nights, 1001 Arabian Nights. Though renowned for his secular pursuits including riotous living, strong drink, and harems of concubines, to the point that a modern-day female Kuwaiti activist referred to him as a model to justify the institution of sex slavery. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid was still pious enough to force Christians to distinguish themselves by dress, to expel them from their positions, and to destroy their churches through the use of fatwas by the imams. Similarly, Saladin, another Muslim ruler who is habitually portrayed in the West as magnanimous and tolerant, commanded that all crucifixes on Coptic church domes be destroyed, and that whoever saw that the outside of a church was white, to cover it with black dirt, as a sign of degradation. Indeed, in 1354, well after the mad Caliph Hakim was gone, churches were still under attack, including by Muslim mobs, who, according to Makrizi, demolished a church anent the Bridge of Lions, and a church in the street Al-Ashra in Misr, and the church of Fahadin within the precincts of Cairo, also the convent of Nia in Giza, and a church in the neighborhood of Batak al-Takruni. They plundered the wealth of the churches they demolished, which was great, and carried away even the woodwork and slabs of alabaster. They rushed upon the churches of Misr, Egypt, and Cairo. From the time the Ottoman Turks first set foot in Thrace under Suleiman, son of Orshan, the empire rapidly disintegrated. From the very beginning of the Turkish onslaught under Suleiman, the Turks tried to consolidate their position by the forcible imposition of Islam. The Ottoman historian, Sakrullah maintained, those who refused to accept the Muslim faith were slaughtered and their families enslaved. Where there were bells, writes the same author, Suleiman broke them up and cast them onto fires. Where there are churches he destroyed them or converted them into mosques. Thus, in place of bells there were now muezzins. Wherever Christian infidels were still found, vassalage was imposed upon their rulers. At least in public they could no longer say Kyrie eleison but rather there is no God but Allah, and where once their prayers had been addressed to Christ, they were now to Mohammed, the Prophet of Allah, Apostolos Evangeliopoulos, a Greek writer and historian. Such was the state of affairs of churches under Islam, explaining how, over the course of nearly 14 centuries, former centers of Christianity like Egypt, Levant, and Anatolia were reduced to sporadic enclaves that came to resemble dilapidated strongholds of Christianity surrounded by a sea of Muslim hostility. According to the historian Bat Ye'er, Christians and Jews living in a Muslim country are subjected to discriminative rules that meant to dehumanize them. Rules for the Tzimmis, Christians and Jews. Rules would be formulated to deny the Tzimmi the due process of the law. Discriminative and restrictive dress and behavior codes would be enacted and severely enforced to reduce the Tzimmi into a state of despair and poverty. Dehumanization of the Tzimmi was not uncommon, and generally the rule. Various forms of physical abuses were common. Many times distinctive dress specified to identify the Tzimmi that he would be unable to either mix with a Muslim or even walk in a Muslim area of the city. Other rules specified such as demeaning codes dress such as no allowed to wear shoes or sandals, not using certain colors, wearing stars on their clothing. Tzimmis were prohibited from working in many occupations. Even rules were made as how a Tzimmi could ride a mule to distinguish him from a Muslim. Non-observance of these rules would entail a severe beating. Often passing a Muslim on the wrong side would begin a beating that could leave the Tzimmi mortally wounded. Since the Tzimmi is denied the right to testify in court against a Muslim, there is absolutely no recourse. If the local Muslim population becomes intolerant or jealous of the successes of the Tzimmis, then a pogrom would ensue. Tzimmi communities could find themselves evicted, women raped, exorbitant ransoms placed on them, their children abducted and forced to convert to Islam, and in other cases mass murders of the Tzimmi population condoned. Hindus under Islamic rule. The Prophet Muhammad promised his followers that they will conquer India. His hadiths that speak of the conquest of India are as follows. It was narrated that Thaba'an, the freed slave of the Messenger of Allah, blessings and peace of Allah be upon him, said, "There are two groups of my ummah, Islamic community, whom Allah will protect from the fire, a group who will conquer India, and a group who will be with Isa ibn Maryam Jesus the son of Mary, peace be upon him." Narrated by Imam Ahmed in al-Musnad, it was narrated that Abu Hurairah, may Allah be pleased with him, said, "The Messenger of Allah, blessings and peace of Allah be upon him, promised us that we would conquer India, so if I am martyred I will be among the best of the martyrs, and if I return then I am Abu Hurairah the freed, protected from hellfire." Alain Danilu, Histoire de l'Inde writes. From the time Muslims started arriving, around 632 AD, the history of India becomes a long, monotonous series of murders, massacres, spoliations, and destructions. It is, as usual, in the name of a holy war of their faith, of their sole God, that the barbarians have destroyed civilizations, wiped out entire races. Mahmud Ghazni was an early example of Muslim ruthlessness, burning in 1018 of the temples of Mathura, razing Kanauj to the ground and destroying the famous temple of Somnath, sacred to all Hindus. His successors were as ruthless as Ghazni. 103 temples in the holy city of Benares were razed to the ground, its marvelous temples destroyed, its magnificent palaces wrecked. The Hindu sage Padmanabha described in his Kanhadade Prabandha in 1456 AD the story of the Muslim invasion of the Gujarat state of 1298 AD. The conquering army burnt villages, devastated the land, plundered people's wealth, took Brahmins and children and women of all classes captive, flogged with thongs of raw hide, carried a moving prison with it, and converted the prisoners into obsequious slaves. The blood of the infidels flowed so copiously at Thainsar that the stream was discolored, notwithstanding its purity, and people were unable to drink it. The Sultan returned with plunder which is impossible to count. Tariq-i-Yamini of Ut by the Sultan's secretary written in the 11th century. The magnitude of crimes credited to Muslim monarchs by the medieval Muslim historians was beyond measure. With a few exceptions, Muslim kings and commanders were monsters who stopped at no crime when it came to their Hindu subjects. But what strikes as more significant is the broad pattern of those crimes. The pattern is that of a jihad in which the Ghazis, invaders, of Islam, 1. Invade infidel lands, 2. Massacre as many infidel men, women, and children, particularly Brahmins, as they like after winning a victory, 3. Capture the survivors to be sold as slaves, 4. Plunder every place and person, 5. Demolish idolatrous places of worship and build mosques in their places, and 6. Defile idols which are flung into public squares or made into steps leading to mosques. Still more significant is the fact that this is exactly the pattern 1, revealed by Allah in the Quran, 2. Practiced, perfected and prescribed by the Prophet in his own lifetime, 3. Followed by the pious Caliphs of Islam in the first 35 years of Islamic imperialism, 4. Elaborated in the hadiths and hundreds of commentaries with meticulous attention to detail, 5. Certified by the ulama and the Sufis of Islam in all ages including our own, and 6. Followed by all Muslim monarchs and chieftains who aspired for name and fame in this life and houris and beardless boys hereafter. Goel, S.R., 2001. The Story of Islamic Imperialism in India. New Delhi, Voice of India. In the year 997 AD a Turkish chieftain by the name of Mahmud became Sultan of the little state of Ghazni, in eastern Afghanistan. Pretending a holy zeal for destroying Hindu idolatry, Sultan Mahmud swept across the frontier with a force inspired by a pious aspiration for booty. He met the unprepared Hindus at Bhim Nagar, slaughtered them, pillaged their cities, destroyed their temples, and carried away the accumulated treasures of centuries. Returning to Ghazni he astonished the ambassadors of foreign powers by displaying jewels and unbeard pearls and rubies shining like sparks, or like wine congealed with ice, and emeralds like fresh sprigs of myrtle, and diamonds in size and weight like pomegranates. Each winter Mahmud descended into India, filled his treasure chest with spoils, and amused his men with full freedom to pillage and kill. Each spring he returned to his capital richer than before. At Mathura, on the Jumna, he took from the temple its statues of gold encrusted with precious stones, and emptied its coffers of a vast quantity of gold, silver, and jewelry. He expressed his admiration for the architecture of the great shrine, judged that its duplication would cost 100 million dinars and the labor of 200 years, and then ordered it to be soaked with naphtha and burnt to the ground. 6 years later he sacked another opulent city of northern India, Somnath, killed all its 50,000 inhabitants, and dragged its wealth to Ghazni. In the end he became, perhaps, the richest king that history has ever known. Sometimes he spared the population of the ravaged cities, and took them home to be sold as slaves, but so great was the number of such captives that after some years no one could be found to offer more than a few shillings for a slave. Before every important engagement Mahmud knelt in prayer, and asked the blessing of God upon his arms. He reigned for a third of a century, and when he died, full of years and honors, Muslim historians ranked him as the greatest monarch of his time, and one of the greatest sovereigns of any age. In 1186 the Guri, a Muslim Turkish tribe of Afghanistan, invaded India, captured the city of Delhi, destroyed its temples, confiscated its wealth, and settled down in its palaces to establish the Sultanate of Delhi, an alien despotism fastened upon northern India for 3 centuries, and checked only by assassination and revolt. The first of these bloody sultans, Qutb-Din Aybak, was a normal specimen of his kind, fanatical, ferocious, and merciless. His gifts, as the Mohammedan historian tells us, were bestowed by hundreds of thousands, and his slaughters likewise were by hundreds of thousands. In one victory of this warrior, who had been purchased as a slave, 50,000 men came under the collar of slavery, and the plain became black as pitch with Hindus. Another sultan, Balban, punished rebels and brigands by casting them under the feet of elephants, or removing their skins, stuffing these with straw, and hanging them from the gates of Delhi. When some Mongol inhabitants who had settled in Delhi, and had been converted to Islam, attempted a rising, Sultan Alauddin, the conqueror of Chittor, had all the males from 15 to 30,000 of them slaughtered in one day. Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq acquired the throne by murdering his father, became a great scholar and an elegant writer, dabbled in mathematics, physics, and Greek philosophy, surpassed his predecessors in bloodshed and brutality, fed the flesh of a rebel nephew to the rebel's wife and children, ruined the country with reckless inflation, and laid it waste with pillage and murder till the inhabitants fled to the jungle. He killed so many Hindus that, in the words of a Muslim historian, there was constantly in front of his royal pavilion and his civil court a mound of dead bodies and a heap of corpses, while the sweepers and executioners were wearied out by their work of dragging the victims and putting them to death in crowds. A clear example of the destruction of the Hindu and Buddhist cultures and their temples can be seen in the siege of Dibble by Muhammad bin Qasim, who marched into India with a large military expedition. In the latter part of the siege of Dibble, defectors informed Muhammad about how the temple could be captured. Following their information, the Arabs planted their ladders on the walls of the citadel and stormed over them. Once they took Dibble, the citizens were given the invitation to accept Islam, and upon refusal the males were slaughtered and the women and children were taken into slavery. The carnage lasted for 3 days, looting, plundering, and rape. Their temple was razed, and was replaced by a mosque. Muhammad left a garrison of 4,000 soldiers in the town. The spoils of conquest were divided first among the leadership and then the common soldiers, and this would be repeated again and again with continued Islamic conquests. As this was the pattern of all future sieges of Muhammad bin Qasim, as indeed of all future Muslim invaders of Hindustan, it may be repeated. Inhabitants of a captured fort or town were invited to accept Islam or face death. India would face 3 major invasions over the centuries, beginning with the Arabs and continuing with the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century AD. Over and over again the same scenario repeated itself, with those who converted being spared and those who did not accept the religion of peace being massacred or enslaved. In every case their temples were destroyed, along with all the idols within them, and the remains of the temple were used to build a mosque on the former temple site. Later Turkish invasions would even be more brutal. The Turkic Seljuk tribes who had converted to Islam were no less destructive to India's largely Hindu and Buddhist population. Like the Arabs, the Turks gave the same invitation to convert or die. Muslim historians do not hide the fact that Islam spread by the sword. Muslim mujahideen have killed millions of infidels, looted their treasures, occupied their lands, enslaved their children, and raped their women. To Muslims, the Islamic conquests or inventions are seen as acts of altruism. They are referred to as futuhat, which literally means openings, that is, the countries conquered were opened for the light of Islam to enter and guide its infidel inhabitants. Thus to Muslims, there is nothing to regret or apologize for concerning the conquests, they are seen as for the good of those who were conquered.